Hey everyone, I'm Tsyrklevich, and this is my brother Eugene Tsyrklevich.
Hi.
And we're going to be talking about OpenID today. The title of our talk is Single Sign-On for the Internet, a Security Story. And the agenda for today is basically to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we're going to be talking about the good things about OpenID, sort of the good security things about it, the bad about OpenID, the security implications of using it, and the ugly problem it addresses. And so we're going to start off with the ugly problem it addresses.
Before we start, how many people know what OpenID is? Okay.
How many people actually have an OpenID?
Okay.
All right. So the ugly problem it addresses is basically managing, 40 or 60 user accounts on a bunch of random online websites. And the question is really, how do you manage all these accounts? If you're anything like me, your single sign-on solution basically consists of a single username, like Tsyrklevich, and two passwords. One for, one throwaway insecure password for like dig and /dot, and one actually secure password that I use for online banking or online communication. So show of hands, who actually uses this scheme? It's not as many of you as I expected, which is good. Or it means you're just putting 40 unique passwords on your screen, or you just, instead of using two passwords, use only one. But the problem with using an approach like this is that a malicious website, to compromise a user, a malicious website only has to fail a user's login attempts. And they could pretty much just watch the user type in every single combination of username and password that he's ever used. And I know that personally, when I can't log into dig or /dot, I try every single possible username password combination I've probably ever used. So an attack like this would definitely succeed even against educated users. So our first piece of BlackHat advice is to change your bank password. We man in the middle of your secure single sign-on last night. And it also leads to our first observation, a common security mantra, but complexity breeds insecurity. And forcing a user, even an educated user, to remember 40 unique passwords for 40 different websites is just impossible. Even a unique user will just use either two passwords or will just stick them all on his monitor. So it's definitely not possible to keep going with this approach. And this is where OpenID comes in. OpenID is a single sign-on system, so it greatly reduces the complexity of managing a million user accounts. Instead, you have a single user account, you have a single password, and you use that all across the internet. So it greatly reduces the complexity of authentication. OpenID basically proves that a user owns a URL. So you get to choose an identity provider, and we'll be talking more about that later. And you basically prove that you are john.doe.name. It answers the who question, who are you? Are you john.doe.name? Are you vlad.tsyrklevich.myopenid.com? It doesn't answer the what question. It doesn't answer, whether I'm allowed to access a certain page or perform a certain function on a website. The actual website implementing OpenID has to implement that. So OpenID deals with authentication and not authorization. So a brief history of OpenID. OpenID was first sort of invented by Brad Fitzpatrick in 2005. Brad Fitzpatrick is fairly well known. He participates in LiveJournal. I think he was one of the creators.
Yeah.
And basically, he created this because if you read a couple dozen blogs, and I know I do, every time you want to post a comment, a lot of times you have to have a unique username and password for every single one of these blogs. And that if you subscribe to 100 blogs, that's simply impossible to do. So he came up with OpenID so that you could only have a single username and password and use it across all these different blogs. The nice thing is that because it's used on the web, it could actually, instead of just being used for blogs, it could be used anywhere, including email, banking, whatever you want to do. So unsurprisingly, the first specification was titled OpenID 1.0, and since then there's been one more finalized specification, OpenID 1.1, which didn't significantly change the protocol. There's one more draft version out right now called OpenID 2.0, and it is significantly different from OpenID 1.1. And in this presentation, we're going to be talking about mostly about OpenID 1.1. So there's probably a dozen single sign-on systems out there. The nice thing about OpenID is that it's actually gaining a lot of mainstream acceptance. A lot of major players like Microsoft, AOL, Sun, they're all starting to back it. And the OpenID integration is actually one of the milestones for Firefox 3. Microsoft actually integrated its own single sign-on solution called CardSpace into OpenID so that you can use CardSpace within OpenID. AOL actually created 63 million new OpenID users when they gave every single AOL users an OpenID URL. So earlier when I asked if any of you had OpenIDs, only a couple of you raised your hands, but if you use AOL, and I mean, who of us doesn't, you actually already have an AOL OpenID. If you use LiveJournal, you already have an OpenID.
Yeah.
Include the AIM users? Does that include the AIM users?
I believe so, yeah.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Microsoft, as I said, integrated CardSpace. Sun is providing OpenID URLs to all employees. The government of Estonia is planning to give every single citizen of Estonia, about 2 to 3 million people, an OpenID and a smart card to be used for online authentication. So it's definitely gaining a lot of support, and it's got a lot more support than other single sign-on solutions. So how does OpenID actually look to sort of the OpenID end user? And we've provided a demo here so that you can see what the end user interaction sort of looks like. And it's actually a man-in-the-middle secure demo because we've only provided screenshots. So this is an example login using OpenID. So here you go to an OpenID-enabled website. In this case, we've chosen jite.com, and you just put in your URL. Your URL can be whatever you want it to be, as long as it's a valid URL. And in this case, it's eugene.tsyrklevich.name. And as you can see below in the examples, there's other possible OpenID URLs you can use, like u.myopenid.com, username.livejournal.com, first.last.name, whatever. So you put in your OpenID URL and you click sign in. And you're redirected from jite.com to myopenid.com. Myopenid.com in this case is eugene.tsyrklevich.name's OpenID provider. And your OpenID provider is sort of your central place for your digital identity. They store all your information, they'll authenticate all your requests. So here you're redirected, your username is already filled in for you, it's eugene.tsyrklevich.name, and you're expected to fill in your password, and if you want to, you can click a little checkbox, stay signed in case you want to be signed in automatically whenever you go to another OpenID enabled website. So you put in your password, you click sign in, and you go to the second screen. And the second screen is basically asking, do you want jite.com to be able to see your information? And this is in case, you go to bank.com and you log in, and then you figure out that, bank.com is you're actually being phished, and some weird website wants to know your information. You can click deny if you want to. The nice thing about OpenID is that you can also store personal information on the central server. So rather than just proving that you're john.doe.name, if you want the convenience of filling out sign-up forms for online banking automatically, this prompt can also ask you, do you want etrade.com to see your full name, your address, your social security number, and it'll greatly enhance the sign-up and login process. It'll be much, much more quick. So if you click allow forever or allow once, you'll be taken back to jite.com, and as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, you're automatically logged in as eugene.tsyrklevich.name. So that process is actually fairly simple for an end user to understand. It's not a huge difference from the current process we're using. However, it seems fairly simple, but there's actually sort of a complex protocol behind it. So there are actually a number of major players sort of in the OpenID login process. First, there's the user actually logging in. So John Doe in the upper left-hand corner. That's you sitting at home with your laptop, browsing to whatever.com. Then there's the OpenID-enabled website. In our example, it was, jite.com. In OpenID parlance, it's called the relying party. Then there's your URL host. For example, if you put in, eugene.tsyrklevich.name, whoever is hosting that URL is also another player in this. And then there's the identity provider. In our case, it was myopenid.com. So this is the part of the presentation where we start talking about the bad things about OpenID, sort of the security problems. And so let's start at the beginning. So after you put in your OpenID URL into the text box, and you click sign in, that OpenID-enabled website, such as jite.com, will download the information at that OpenID URL. And the reason it does that is because let's say you enter in, foobar.com/max. With that URL, the OpenID enabled website doesn't know what your identity provider is. There's nothing intrinsic in the URL that says what your identity provider is or what your username on that identity provider is. If you want, eugene.tsyrklevich.name can be both your username and your URL, as it is in this case, but it doesn't have to be. So the reason it downloads this URL, or the information at that URL, is for these two HTML tags that you see in this display. It strips out this information. The first tag specifies your OpenID identity provider, that's openid.server. And the second tag specifies your username on that identity provider. So in this case, it's eugene.tsyrklevich.name. So it downloads this so it can get the information about your identity provider and your username. However, there's a number of problems with this. URLs are fairly flexible, and a malicious user, if you wanted to, could go to an OpenID-enabled website and use it as a man in the middle to scan a remote host. There's nothing stopping a user from entering in a malicious URL like nsa.gov port 1, nsa.gov port 2, and continuing to do this forever to essentially scan that host. And because it's the relying party, because it's jite.com actually downloading this URL, if a security analyst at nsa.gov, looks at the packets flying by, he's going to think it's jite.com and not you. There's also a number of other things that you can do with malicious URLs. You can access internal resources that you wouldn't have access to otherwise because they're firewalled off. And you might be able to access privileged information, or you might be able to do some sort of nasty thing which you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. There's a lot of interesting things you can do with localhost. When you put in localhost, again, jite.com will download that URL, so it'll actually contact itself on the loopback interface. Now, if you try to port scan jite.com, from the outside behind the firewall, you might